Being a guest on a podcast is a great opportunity to get introduced to new audiences. And as long as you do a good job of giving during that podcast interview, rather than just pitching or selling, it's a great way to grow your audience, get new customers, grow your influence, all these things that you would get from, say, a speaking event at a conference, but it's much easier to do.
Welcome to Side Hustle Hero, the show that is laser focused to inspire you to take action to start or to scale your side hustle income streams. I'm your host, Joan Posivy, author of The Way Success Works, How to Decide, Believe, and Begin to Live Your Best Life. Have you ever thought about being a guest on a podcast? Whatever your area of expertise happens to be, chances are there are podcasts out there that would be a great fit for the knowledge and insights you have to share. But how do you find those podcasts? And once you are booked, what are some best practices you have to know to be successful? Today's guest, Andrew Alleman, is going to help with that. He started a podcast as an offshoot of his trade publication in the domain name industry. But after about a year, he ran into a problem. He had come to the end of his Rolodex and was finding it hard to connect with new guests. His is the classic story of an entrepreneur seeing a need and then filling it. I'll let Andrew tell you the story, but know that he has now published over 400 episodes of his podcast, and his solution to finding guests evolved into a service which today has over 38,000 subscribers. He knows a thing or two about bootstrapping a side hustle. In today's end of episode takeaways, I focus in on how you get the best results as a guest and let you know about an underused free tool that connects your side hustle with great publicity opportunities. Now here is my conversation with side hustle hero, Andrew Alleman. Hey, Andrew, welcome, and thanks for joining us.
Oh, thanks. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, earlier this month, you were presented with an industry award for, and I quote, an exceptional contribution to fostering a sense of community within the domain name industry. What a wonderful attribute to be recognized for. Congratulations, Andrew.
Oh, thank you. This award is in memoriam of a dear colleague from the domain name industry. So it means a lot to me to win this award.
Yeah. Well, you're well known in that space for a long time now through your company, Domain Name Wire. But I understand that when you added a podcast to the site, you ran into a problem after about episode 50 or so. And I will ask you about that. But first, give us a bit of a background on what Domain Name Wire does and what that business model looks like.
Sure. So Domain Name Wire, think of it as a trade publication for the domain name industry. So for those probably aren't familiar, that there is an industry, but you probably registered a domain at some place like GoDaddy, right? And so
Sure.
There are a bunch of companies like GoDaddy. There are over 1,000 that help you register domain names. And so I write a lot about what those companies are doing and then what people who buy and sell domains are doing. So various topics around that. The blog, if you will, has been around since 2005. It has well over 10,000 posts. So I've been covering that industry for 17 years now as kind of a journalist trade publication. And in about 2014 is when I introduced a podcast as part of that.
And did you say 10,000 posts?
Yes.
Wow.
It's probably more like 12,000 now. You had asked about the business model. Honestly, it started out kind of as a side hustle, but it wasn't. The site started out as a hobby that I was doing while I was doing other business. And then, a little while in, some of the companies in the space emailed me and said, "Hey, great site. Could we advertise?" Right. And I was like, well, sure. I'll take your money.
Wow.
And
Nice.
so, it kind of grew from there. So it's all ad supported at this point. We just have a number of domain name companies that pay monthly or annually to have ads on the site.
And then you said it was about 2014 that you started the podcast.
That's right. Yeah. I was kind of taking a look around and, at one point, people in the domain name business got most of their information from forums, and those kind of died off. There's still one main one, but it kind of shifted to blogs. And I was kind of looking around. I was like, I don't want to be 5, 10 years from now, I don't want people to look back and they've shifted on from blogs to something else, right? So I
Right.
need to expand what I'm doing media wise. And that's when I added a podcast. It was also nice because most of my stories on the site are fairly short. And a podcast gave me an opportunity to have more in-depth conversations with people. So these, 30-minute conversations where we can really dig into topics and I can push them a little bit harder with questions and that sort of thing. So that it's up to four. Let's see. Today I'm recording episode 405, I believe, of the podcast.
Nice.
So it's basically been a weekly show ever since then.
And how did you start to launch it way back then?
I already had an audience, which was helpful, right? I had an audience interested in domain names, but I read a lot into how do you start a podcast, and I totally overthought it.
Okay.
I was renting space from a friend who had a small office building, and he was interested in getting into podcasting. So he said, let's set up a podcast studio. So I researched everything we needed. We got the paneling all around us. We got the microphone. We got this dedicated space. And I spent way too much time trying to figure out all the aspects of it rather than just diving in. It probably set me back about 6 months.
Okay.
But it was helpful to have to have an audience already to bring to the audience rather than trying to just create an audience through a podcast, which can be a little bit more challenging because of discoverability issues around podcasts.
And how did you generate your guests, or how did you find them?
So for the first year, it was just calling up people in my Rolodex that I knew from the domain name industry. And I was like, hey, I'm doing a show. The first person was my guinea pig. I, reached out to someone who I figured, if it didn't work out, he wouldn't be mad about it.
It wouldn't give you too hard of a time.
Exactly. And so that's what I did for the first year. And then, I started getting through there about 50 interviews, and I'm like, whew, I've talked to a lot of people already. Who do I find next? How do I find
Right.
some new and interesting people that I'm not familiar with? And that was what was the impetus for creating podcastguest.com.
How did you launch that?
I looked around for ways for other services that would help me find guests. And what I found at the time was there were really just these agencies, and they charged a lot of money, thousands of dollars a month to help you find guests. And that wasn't practical for me. So I said, well, I guess I could try creating a service that's free for people to use. And I modeled it off of a popular public relations tool called Help a Reporter Out, or HARO.
Hmm.
And that's a system where, like, let's say you're a Wall Street Journal reporter and you're trying to find cases where people are maybe not buying a house because interest rates are up, right? They don't necessarily have friends who are in that situation. So they'll put out a request on this service that says, hey, we're looking for people in this situation.
Right.
If you qualify, reach out to us. So I decided to do the same thing for podcasts, which is, okay, this is Side Hustle Hero. Here are the guests, the types of guests we're looking for. If this is you, fill out a pitch form.
Perfect.
And so that was kind of how it started. It was all email based. And I really started really small. I just emailed some podcasters, some of whom I knew, some that I didn't know, and said, hey, I'm going to try this out. I'm having this issue. You might be having this issue too. Don't know how this is going to go, but do you mind if I add you to this email? And I got about 100, 200 people originally before I sent out that first email. And I think in the first email, I had, 4 podcasts looking for guests. Mine was probably one of them.
Right.
And people started pitching, and it wasn't a lot, but some of the podcasts got 5 to 10 pitches from the people that were already on the list. And I was like, hey, that's interesting. And then so I just kept kind of building it from there and changing the business model, or I should say adding new features in response to the requests of what I would call the community.
Okay. What were some of those changes that you made?
Well, I had people telling me, especially PR professionals that managed clients, they said, this is great. I can come in and pitch to shows that are on this service, but that takes a lot of time. And it'd be great and it's got to be the right show. You have to be featuring the right show. It'd be great if you could feature my client and then podcasters could come to them. And so I had a number ask me repeatedly for this. And then I was at a podcast movement conference, which is a big podcasting event. And one of the people came up to me and he said, look, if you build this, I'll, add 25 people immediately tomorrow. And I was like, okay, well, that's a pretty good, vote of confidence. I can actually go out and spend the money to develop this system where people can create their profiles on the service. And so I
Nice.
would say that was the major influx. So I'd originally thought this would just be an ad-based business because that's what I
Hmm.
know. But with that, it really it turned into kind of a directory subscription model where now, even though I have 38,000 people, about 1,000 of them pay a monthly fee to be in this directory.
38. Nice. And about 1,000 paid subscribers.
Mhm.
And just as a side note, you mentioned that you ran into this person or connected with them during a conference.
Mhm.
I've always found that's just an excellent thing to do in whatever industry.
Yeah, I originally met this person at a conference and connected with them, and then we had communicated a little bit. And he signed up for my service, and then it was at another conference, right, a year or two later, where we reconnected, and he told me this. And he wasn't the first person to suggest this idea, but his confidence that, hey, I'll put 25 people on, I'll pay to put them on there, was enough to kind of push me over the edge.
Kind of that MVP.
Yeah, so minimum viable product, and so which is really the story of the entire business. I mean, I started out as a very raw MVP, very minimal investment. I had a Mailchimp account, which is free for the first, I don't know, 1,000, 2,000 subscribers.
Yep.
I had a landing page for people to sign up. That was maybe $40 a month. I had a domain name. It was registered by someone else. I bought it for just a few $100s. And then, yeah, I mean, everything else, all the other technology was free, right, to start. Later I had to invest in getting my developer to really build this out, especially with the directory. Now you're talking credit cards, you're talking subscriptions, that sort of stuff. That's a
Sure.
little more complicated.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm a big fan in the MVP. I will say that now that the service is bigger, there may be some you do have to kind of go back and change things, right? As something scales, if you take that approach,
Sure.
it's much better than spending gobs and gobs of money on a product when you're not sure what the take up is going to be.
Because at one point it's just an idea in your mind and you're thinking, I wonder if this is going to fly or not.
Right.
So it sounds
Exactly.
like you were able to test the idea
Yeah.
relatively cost effectively.
Yeah. Everyone has their cost threshold, right? I mean, I started the service for just single digit thousands of dollars, and then I invested over $10,000 eventually in the development side of it, but not at first, right? And so I had a pretty
Sure.
good idea it was going to work. And if it didn't, then I was just out thousands of dollars, not tens of thousands of dollars.
Smart. Have you ever gone from that idea stage to the testing stage and then decided or discovered that the idea wasn't going to fly and you scrapped it?
Well, look, I've had plenty of businesses that haven't worked out,
Okay.
that I've been involved in, or I've been an investor in, a lot of times where it sounds like a great idea, but it's not, right? Or you
Right.
find out there's too much competition, or you find out this need you thought was there really wasn't there.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, that happens all the time, whether it's a new, testing a new idea on the service. At one point, I offered podcast cover art services to podcasters, and some of them took me up on it,
Okay.
but it wasn't enough to really justify the
Hmm.
time that went into it. So
Yeah. I think these stories are important because from somebody from the outside looking in or listening to this, they're thinking, wow, he's built this up from like 0 to 30,000, 38,000 subscribers. Things must be going great. And of course, it's not, everything doesn't work out all the time. It's because you've taken those chances and tried different things and found
well,
what's worked.
tell you, I mean, if the first couple of years, I wasn't really making any money, and I was putting a lot of work into this, spending money and time. And, I remember talking to an entrepreneurs group I'm part of, and I'm like, you know, it's really, yeah, I'm making maybe $1,000 a month, but this isn't really interesting. If only I could get to this. And then the next year it had gone up to, $5,000 a month. And I said, oh, well, that's almost interesting. I'm still putting time and effort into this.
Right.
But then it really kind of started to take off. So, I mean, 2016 was 6 years ago, right? And so, although it's a great business now, I put a lot of effort into that, and there were plenty of times to quit in between now and then.
Awesome. And at what point did you say it was enough to get excited about? How many years in was
You
that?
know, I would say around late 2019, early 2020.
Okay.
And then the pandemic hit, and I was like, whew, I don't know what's going to happen here.
Mm-hmm.
It turned out being uh, fantastic for the business
Yes.
because everyone got into podcasting. Everyone was trying to figure out how to market themselves if they couldn't go to conferences. So, I would have much rather the pandemic not come along, but
Of
it
course.
certainly shot up the trajectory of the business.
Yes, yes. And with 38,000 people now signed up with podcast guests and 405 now episodes
Mm.
under the belt for you, you've got a lot of experience there with podcasting. And personally, I think anyone wanting to start or scale their side hustle should at least consider being a guest on podcasts or maybe even start their own show.
Mhm.
What benefits have you seen come to entrepreneurs who have added this to their marketing and promo mix?
Right. I think there are two sides on that. So let's start with being a guest because I think before you host a podcast, you should probably try being a guest and see if you like it. You don't
Sage
like being a
advice.
guest, you don't want to be a host. I mean, being a guest on a podcast is a great opportunity to get introduced to new audiences. And as long as you do a good job of giving during that podcast interview, rather than just pitching or selling, it's a great way to grow your audience, get new customers, grow your influence, all these things that you would get from say a speaking event at a conference, but it's
Yes,
much easier to do, right? We're doing this from the comfort of our own homes, at a time that works for us, and it's not super high stakes. This is something that can be edited, so
exactly.
even if you're not super comfortable talking on stage, this isn't nearly as challenging. And there's a podcast for everything, right? So it's much easier to get booked as a guest on podcasts than say get speaking gigs at a conference or get on your local TV station if that's even helpful to you.
Hmm.
So I think the benefits from being a guest are pretty clear. Hosting a podcast, I think there are a lot of reasons to start a podcast. There's some that probably aren't a good reason. So I think it's a great way again to increase your influence and your audience as the host. It's also a great way to get connected to people. So by inviting someone on your show, you are getting a one-on-one conversation with them. They become part of your network. Maybe they become a customer or a partner in the future.
Hmm.
And, these are people that you couldn't necessarily just call up and say, hey, I want to talk for 30 minutes. I mean, if you had reached out to me and said, hey, I want to talk for 30 minutes about podcastguest.com, probably would have said, that's nice. Can we just chat over email? Time, right?
For sure, for sure.
But when you reach out and you say, hey, I'd love to have you on my podcast and introduce you to my audience, then you're giving them something, right? So it's a
Hmm.
great way to get those introductions, if you will.
Hmm.
I think about it like let's say you're a lawyer in Seattle and you're looking for, you want to build your book of business or an accountant. You could start a podcast that features startups in the area, right? So it's not about law, it's not about accounting, it's about startups. But each of those startups that you talk to is a potential future client down the road when they might call you up when they have a legal issue. And then the people that listen to that show are like, wait, who? Yeah, we're starting a business. We need to hire an attorney. Wait, who's that lawyer who hosts that show? That sort of thing, right? And
Absolutely.
so you might not directly correlate, oh, I published a podcast and this is what came of it, right? Or not right away. So sometimes you can,
Yes.
if you're an author or you're selling a product or a service, that sort of thing, you can correlate that. But I think that I'll give you an example that wraps this all together. I was listening to a podcast called My First Million, and they had a guest on there, Rob Walling, and he was giving just great information. It was very educational about running micro businesses and bootstrap businesses like mine. And at the end, he said, "Yeah, if you liked what we talked about today, you'll probably like my podcast, Startups for the Rest of Us." So I said, "Oh, okay." Checked out that podcast, subscribe to that show now, and listen frequently. And one of the episodes was an author, and I bought his book. And then there was another episode with another author, and I bought their book. And then
Right.
I signed up for one of Rob's services that he talks about in every episode, and I got involved in his group. So I paid him money. I just went to a local meetup he had in Seattle a couple of weeks ago. So you see how kind of
Nice.
that, can he directly measure his appearance on My First Million with the extra revenue and listener, et cetera? No, but it's
No.
right.
And all the way through that, he was providing really good content.
Exactly. He wasn't there just to sell, right?
Right.
Not trying to just sell a product or service, which is a mistake I see a lot of people make.
I was just going to say, because you had mentioned earlier that there are reasons for people not to get into doing a podcast. Is that kind of what you were alluding to?
No, I would say the reason not to get in is because you want to get tons of downloads and sell ads against it, because that is the hardest thing to do. And a lot of
Okay.
people come in thinking they're going to be the next Joe Rogan or something like that, and of their topic, and get millions of dollars. And that's very hard to do. You almost have to have a big audience already to make that work. So but I do think one mistake people make a lot as a guest, and sometimes as a host too, is trying to sell too much. You see this especially with a guest. Like if I came on here and I was like, well, Joan, let me tell you about my 5-step system, and all I need is $1,000 from you, and I'm going to get you booked on all these shows, that sort of thing.
Right.
People are going to stop listening right away.
Yeah.
Right. But instead, if I, educate people and give them tips,
Mhm.
hopefully some of them will come check it out. Some will sign up for free, and eventually some of those people will pay.
And the author that is selling his or her book and the host asks them a question, they'll say, well, if you buy the book, you can read about it.
Yeah. No, it's the gentle, in the book, we talk about this, and that's the sort of thing that, people like. I purchased more books than I can remember from hearing the author on a podcast, because I'm like, that's really interesting. There's this Spycast podcast where they interview people about spycraft and that sort of stuff. And there was an author on there, and, he gave away the narrative of his nonfiction book. But, there was a lot of detail that wasn't in there, and it was a topic I love. So I went and bought the book. So
Terrific.
you don't need to sell it, right? You need to mention it, and the podcast author or the podcast host will do that. But you don't need to sell it yourself. I had one person reach out and he's like, I've been on 30 podcasts over the past year, and I haven't gotten a single client from it. And he does, I guess, coaching. And then he said, I go on these podcasts, I talk about all my services and how I help people. And I was like, whoa. I think you're approaching this the wrong way, right? If you go on there and just educate, right, then people are going to look you up afterward, and then that can result in some clients over time. But just going on and trying to sell is not going to work.
I couldn't agree more. You had mentioned that some people might turn to podcasting too, even as guests, because speaking in front of a conference or an audience might be a little bit scary.
Right.
An upcoming guest told me in a recent email that she was both excited and frightened about being on my podcast coming up soon. What advice would you give to someone who is a bit nervous about being interviewed?
Right. Yeah. As my kid says, nervous sighted about being on your show.
Perfect.
The great thing about podcasts, most of them don't have video, right? We're not recording video here, so I didn't need to comb my hair. I comb my hair for you because I didn't need to put a nice shirt on this morning, that sort of thing. If you look at the stack, right, of media opportunities, so you have radio, which is audible, right, which is great, but it's live, right? And if you do mess up, everyone hears it. You have TV, which is both live and video, and certainly nerve-wracking. Then you have those live speaking events, and everyone gets butterflies in their stomach, even if they've done it a million times, right? So the nice thing that I tell people about podcasts is it's okay if you make a mistake. We can edit it out. And so, I think that makes people a lot more comfortable. People still get nervous. People tell me after a show, oh, I was really nervous about that. But I try to set them at ease at the beginning. I always tell them, hey, this will be edited if you make a mistake. And now that everyone's doing this from home, like, look, if your doorbell rings, your dog starts barking, that's okay. Just pause. Let's wait for the noise to pass, and then we'll restart, and then we'll edit that out. So
Sure.
I think as a host, you can put your people at ease by talking about that editing standpoint. You can tell sometimes when people are really nervous and their answers aren't very good and that sort of thing, and you kind of do need to put them at ease. I had one person on my show where we talked for 15 minutes before we started recording, and he was great. As soon as I hit that record button, he just everything just fell apart. Right? He couldn't keep his thoughts. He was just nervous, and I get that. But the other nice thing is that a lot of podcasts are low stakes. We're not talking about millions of listeners, especially on the shows you're going to get on right away.
Yeah.
And so, if it's not your best performance, just do more, right? And that practice will make perfect. And
Yes.
if you don't sound perfect, it's not the end of the world.
And there's always going to be that first podcast that you go on,
Right.
right?
Right.
I don't like any performer, anything. There's always going to be a first. So you're not going to do it perfectly.
Right. And just like you practice before you do a speech, have a spouse or a friend, ask you some questions and you can answer them. And that yeah, I think practice helps, but again, it's not the end of the world. It's a podcast. You're not on the Today Show. So
Absolutely. Yes. And if it's somebody that I know who I'm interviewing that has not done a lot of shows, I'll on purpose call it a conversation instead of an interview, because some people have this negative feeling around the word interview, like back in a job that they had. And it's like, no, we're just going to have a conversation
right.
like you and I are having now. If someone is not getting booked as often as they'd like, what are some things that they can do to increase the chance that a podcaster will say, yes, come on my show?
Yeah, I always tell people to think about what their pitch is and to niche down. And so that means, if you're a coach, like a business coach, there are probably millions of business coaches in the world. That's not too interesting to a podcaster. But
Right.
let's say you're pitching an accounting podcast to be a guest and you're a coach for accountants. Well, that starts to get more interesting, right? To that accountant, they're like, oh, that's actually pretty interesting. This person knows my business and they have some value add here, right? And so
Right.
I always tell people not to be too high level. You want to be a big fish in a small pond rather than a small fish in a big pond, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so that's kind of some of my advice. Another thing I do is tell the person what you'll do to help promote the show after you're on it. One thing that we put on our directory listings on podcastguest.com is, hey, how will you help promote the show after you're on the show? Because a podcast host is always trying to grow their audience, right? Part of the reason they want you on the show is to hopefully bring in some of your audience to listen to it. So
Right.
to the extent that you're going to post it on social media, to your email list, that sort of thing, that's helpful. And I added that after having a conversation with someone at a conference who talked about how he always got pitched from people to be on their show, and it was all about what being on the show would do for that person. It was never about what that person could do for the show by being a guest. And he's like, I want people to promote the show. And I was like, oh, that's a really good point. So we added that now, and it's actually a mandatory field on our directory listings. What you'll do to help promote the show after you're on it.
Yes. Yeah. And you want to take into account, the listeners, what do they want to hear? How are you going to help them? Right. And I should mention too, on your website, you've got an excellent guide. I think you called it Guide to Being a Podcast Guest.
Yeah, it's you can download it for free. It's podcastguest.com/guide, and it
Mm-hmm.
walks through what you need to do for pitching, what you need to do for a technical setup if you're worried about that. How to prepare for the show, and then what to do after the show as well. It's very short and simple, but I think for people that have not been a guest on a show or just getting started and want to improve, I think it's a good guide to help with that.
I thought there was really good content in there. And I was reading it recently and I was literally laughing out loud because in it you said, find a quiet place to do the recording. Pro tip, a walk-in clothes closet is a great place to record a podcast. The clothes absorb the sound echo.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
just a few weeks ago, Andrew, I was on the road and I needed to record like an intro and outro to an episode that I was doing because I had to get it in. And I was looking around this home and all the rooms were quite big. There was no carpeting. And I thought, what am I going to do here? And that's exactly what I did. I went in the clothes closet with my laptop, with my flashlight, and it worked great.
Good.
So good tip. But of course, as an entrepreneur, solopreneur, there are definitely times when it's not a case of, can I do this or not? It's like, okay, how do we solve this problem? How can we get this done? I'm sure you know that all too well.
Exactly.
From a podcaster standpoint, what's your feeling about the best ways to monetize a podcast? And have you seen any unique ways to do that?
Yeah. I mean, I guess I'd reiterate that advertising is tough until you have a big audience. Advertising is typically sold on what's called a CPM, a cost per thousand.
Mm-hmm.
And most podcasts don't have 1,000 downloads per episode, right? So it's really hard to sell something when you don't even have 1,000 downloads. But the other ways to monetize the show are, one, if you have your own products or services, or if you can, you have a community that you can push people to, or those relationships that you are establishing with your guests and the guest audience as well. So I would look at it more from that perspective. I
Hmm.
mean, look, I have ads on my podcast and on my wife's podcast, and it's worked out well for us, but it's tricky, right? And you kind of have to have an audience before you have advertisers. And so it can take a while to get there as well. So I like to focus more on what are the other benefits that you get from hosting a podcast.
Hmm. And how long would you recommend that a person commit to doing it
Mm.
in order for them to sort of see some results or get a feel for it?
A lot of podcasts don't make it to 10 episodes. And I see this all the time. When we feature a podcast in our newsletter, they have to have at least 10 episodes first, because I know
Mm,
that a lot won't get there. And I tell people they can go ahead and submit their show before then, but we'll wait till 10. And I can tell you, I've got a lot of podcasts that I never feature because they never get to 10. Another break point is about a year, because I think people kind of take a look around. Maybe they've done 50 episodes or so and are like, how's this working for me? What benefits am I getting from it? Right.
right.
And then once you get past that, you tend to kind of stick with it longer. But, I think it's important to set goals and strategy, realistic expectations. Starting a podcast is not like starting a blog, in that, yeah, there are a lot fewer podcasts out there. There's less competition, but discoverability in podcasts is really bad, right? So if someone searches Apple for a topic that you had on one of your shows, they're not, they don't have the transcripts. They're not like Google searching a blog post where they see the keywords. And so
Right.
it can be really difficult, and it can be a slow build as well. So there's a lot that goes into it. And I think a lot of people think, oh, I'll just throw my show out there and all of a sudden I'll get a lot of guests, or sorry,
Hmm.
a lot of listeners.
Yes.
And unless you have an audience already, it takes a while to build that up. Now, people can be pretty sticky, right? Once you have that audience, once you have those ravenous fans, it can be great, but it can take a while to get there.
What are some of the ways you've seen that people have built up their number of downloads or listenership over the years?
Yeah, well, I mean, the number one way is to be a guest on other shows.
Okay.
And, like that example I gave earlier with the guy who I learned from another podcast,
Hmm.
because 100% of the people listening to podcasts are podcast listeners by definition. And you're not going to find that anywhere else. If you're doing social media marketing, maybe 20% of the people listen to podcasts, and then they've got to click through, and then they've got to get it into their app and that sort of stuff. Whereas if you're talking and someone's already listening to a podcast, it's really simple for them to add your show, right? So
Hmm.
that's a
Good point.
a great way to kind of grow your show. And again, having good guests on your show too, if they help promote it afterward, that can expand it as well. So I think that the people that I've seen do really well on it, that maybe weren't early to the game in podcasting, have a multi-pronged strategy, right? They have a podcast, but they also have a big social media presence or a big blog or a combination of those that they can use together, to grow that audience.
Which is exactly what you did.
Right, exactly.
You may have already answered this, but what do you think comes as the biggest surprise to someone new to podcasting? Like something that they weren't expecting or they didn't anticipate?
Hmm. Yeah, I would say, it is a lot of work.
Yeah.
When we're done here, you're not done, right? You've got to edit the show. And so I actually outsource the editing of mine to a producer who takes care of all that. But, finding guests, coming up with your what you're going to ask them, doing that post-production, getting it out there, it is a lot of work. And so
Hmm.
I think it's gotten easier to start a podcast in recent years. There are lots of tools out there. There's free and cheap hosting. And so I think a lot of people jump into it thinking it's going to be easy. Whereas, as you know, it's actually quite a bit of work to do it. And that's why I recommend people start by being a guest, so that they can, and again, being a guest is not as much work as being a host or producing a show. So if you
Sure.
feel like you're overwhelmed doing that, then you probably don't want to be a podcaster yourself.
That's sage advice. I know it's going to vary, but if a podcaster wants to have a show where the episode maybe, let's just call it a half an hour, how much editing time do you think would need to go into that? Now, obviously, at the beginning, it's going to be way more.
Yeah, I've heard
Yeah.
people say like 4 minutes for every minute of audio, right? Which would be about two
Okay.
hours. I think that depends. editors charge, I think I pay $125 per episode
Hmm.
per 30 minute to have someone edit. Maybe it's 150. I'm not sure, and I think that's probably fairly typical. And so you need to kind of ask yourself too, like my wife uses an editor, but she also edits it because she goes through the interviews, cuts a lot of stuff, and
Right.
then, and does a lot of that pre-work and hands it over. And I don't know. I mean, she's got to, well, first of all, you got to listen to the entire interview, right? So that's 30 minutes. And then you're stopping and starting. And then, did I cut the right part? Did I leave the right part in? That sort of thing. So
For sure.
easily see how that could take an hour to 2 hours to do a 30-minute interview, even if you have someone doing post production kind of sound work for you.
Hmm. Yeah. I remember my first few episodes, it took forever,
I bet.
forever. And I'm still learning ways to become more efficient at it. And
Right.
that learning will continue for sure. What's the best place for our listeners to connect with you, Andrew?
Well, you can go to podcastguest.com.
Okay.
As you mentioned, I have the guide you can download at podcastguest.com/guide, but you can also sign up for free. All you need to do is put in your email address and your name, and then you'll get an email from me, an auto response that has my email address. So if you need to reach out about anything, you just reply to that message, and that's a great way to connect with me.
Wonderful. Great resource. Oftentimes, it's the start that stops most people. Their brilliant idea to start or to scale their side hustle remains just an idea. You started from episode 1 of a podcast and persevered to now you've done over 400 shows. You've grown podcastguest.com from 0 to 38,000, you said.
Mm-hmm.
Andrew, what's your best tip to help someone take action on their idea as you have on yours?
Yeah, it's all about that first step. And so I say, look at the minimum viable product. What's the absolute minimum you can do to get this out there? Which is advice I did not take on my own podcast. As I mentioned, I spent 6 months trying to make it perfect. And then I
Mm-hmm.
changed a lot of stuff after I started getting feedback from people, right? That feedback's so important. So what's the absolute minimum product you can get out there to test and get that feedback to develop, rather than trying to come up with the entire solution yourself, thinking what people are looking for before you push it out the door.
And you'll feel so much better for it too.
Yes.
That you've actually tried it, because there's an energy, there's an excitement, there's a momentum that builds.
Absolutely.
And, through what the process you just described, you'll realize that, hey, there really is something here, or you know what, maybe I need to rethink this.
Right.
But that action piece is so important. Thank you so very much, Andrew, for your insider's perspective on podcasting and on sharing your story and so much sage advice, and very inspirational, and for being today's side hustle hero.
Thank you.
There's no doubt that being on a podcast or on the radio or on TV can help position you as an expert in your field. But for that to happen, be sure to focus on providing solid content. What will be helpful to the listeners? If your side hustle is offering, say, interior design expertise, instead of talking about the consulting services you offer, share tips on how to transform a room in your home for little or no money. Or if your clientele and the audience are high income earners, perhaps you'll talk about the must have latest trends coming out of Europe. Focus on helping the listeners, not selling your product or service. Then, when you do have the opportunity to share your website or social media info, and listeners found what you shared helpful, they can look you up and connect and maybe turn into great customers. Another way to appeal to the media in general is to consider how you can tie your message into current events. An efficient way to do that is through something called Google Alerts. You tell Google what topics you want to be alerted about, and it'll send you emails whenever Google finds that topic mentioned in websites, blogs, and searches within the Google network. And the service is absolutely free. So, for example, I get alerts anytime side hustle is mentioned in the news. The related stories provide me the opportunity to learn of A, potential side hustle hero guests I may want to invite on the podcast, and B, topics concerning side hustles that I may want to weigh in on in the media for some free publicity. You can do exactly the same for your industry. It's a great way to keep up to date with the latest news in your industry. And there's lots of search parameters you can set, including the regions you want to pull from, the sources, the frequency. It's a great publicity tool because as you scan through the headlines, you may find that you have expertise to be able to contribute to the conversation and reach out to the media. Just go to google.com/alerts. Again, google.com/alerts. Well, that's a wrap for today. You'll find the links we mentioned and the show notes on our website, sidehustleheropodcast.com. And I'd love to hear your feedback on the show, on the guests, how this podcast is helping you, what areas could we do better. Shoot me an email message to hello@joanposivy.com or by DM on Instagram @JoanPosivy. Thanks for listening and hustle on.